Now that the rings are filed to the correct gap, it's time to install them on the piston. I have here a connecting rod and piston from my rotating assembly. It's a stroker kit. Turns my 289 into a 347. On a lot of stroker kits, because the throw of the crank is increased, in the case of a 289 going to 347, the throw of the crank moves from 1.87 inches to 3.4. It's quite a substantial increase. Because of that, the rod has to travel further as it goes to the arc, so it has to be longer. This is a 5.4 inch rod. And as a result of that change in geometry, it becomes necessary to move the wrist pin hole in the piston. Now Mahle's been able to do that without going into the ring, the oil control ring groove. On a lot of stroker kits, the wrist pin actually goes into this groove here, and you have to put in an insert piece, basically an aluminum plug that goes in there, and then the oil control ring goes in and holds the whole thing in place. And it works, but not as effectively as if the oil control ring and groove were ineffective. So Mahle, in stopping just short of the oil control ring with the location of the wrist pin, has really helped out with longevity of oil sealing. So in order to control the oil and the exhaust gases in the bore, the piston has 3 sets of rings. In most cases, on automotive engines, aviation engines sometimes have a 4th one. At the bottom you have what's called the oil control ring. It's made of 3 pieces. There's a very thin ring, 2 of them, one that goes on the top and the bottom of an expandable metal piece. Now this expandable metal piece, it would be almost impossible to see it on the camera, but it has a little flange on the inside. So when you put this together, the thin rings on the top and the bottom actually sit up against that and rest against the little flange on the back side of the ring, and they hold this thing together inside that groove. So first to go on the piston will be the oil control ring, which will be at the bottom. Next will be our second ring, which helps control the combustion gases, and then the third ring we'll install will be the top ring, which is the primary ring to control the exhaust gases. In this case, they're Mahle pistons, and Mahle coats their top ring with a special coating to help it both withstand the exhaust gases but also stay lubricated against the piston wall. Mahle is really big on putting coatings on the pieces themselves. So the rings have coatings, the piston itself has coatings. That's why it has this unique color to it. It's a forged aluminum piston, doesn't look like a natural aluminum color. That's because this coating that's been put on it is a lubrication enhancement, primarily intended to help the rings move around in their grooves properly. And then the skirt itself has a darker area here, and that's on either side of the skirt. And that's to help prevent scuffing on the cylinder wall on a cold start. When the piston first starts to move in the bore, it rocks one way going up, the other way coming down, and the skirts actually touch the wall. And on a dry start, a cold start, there's not enough lubrication on the cylinder walls typically, so this coating will help prevent scuffing of the cylinder walls. One of the mistakes that is often made in installing the rings is the failure to use a tool like this. This is a piston ring installer tool. Looks like a pair of pliers, but it has a little V-shaped groove in the front here. And all you have to do to use it is to place the piston ring in the tool like this, and then squeeze it. And when you squeeze it, it expands the ring. And that allows you to place the ring over the piston down into the ring groove, and then you can release it and it'll stay in the groove. It's really important to use a tool like this when you're installing the top and the second ring, especially if you're using iron rings, because while the rings are very strong for their intended use, they don't hold up much to twisting. And what a lot of people will do is they'll hook one side of the ring into a groove on the piston, and then they'll spiral the ring around to get into the groove and pull out as they do so. You'll hear people say not to do that because as the corner of the ring goes over the piston, it can groove it a little bit or gouge it, and that's true. But the bigger reason to avoid that sort of a method is because of the possibility of actually snapping a ring as you twist it. That's not a problem for the oil control ring. So I'm going to start with that. First, I'm going to go ahead and put the expander. Now, Mahle is kind enough to paint a portion of it red so you can see where the opening is, because once it's installed it can be a little difficult to see. This one is not a problem to spiral around, and you just put it in place in the groove and you can see the red section that tells us where they're lined up. You want to make sure that the ends of this expander are butted up against each other, not overlapped. And so that just sort of sits in there like that. Next, you'll take one of the thin metal rings, put it on the bottom side of the expander, and spiral around, making sure that it does in fact stay on the bottom of the expander. And that's in place now. Next, you'll put on the other ring on the top side of the expander. Now, you'll hear a lot of people talk about where the gaps should be. You'll see pictures and they'll show very precise indications of where the gap should be for each of the rings that you install. I would say don't put a lot of effort into that at all. I got my advice from Mahle, who has great instructions that come with the Pistons and an instructional video on their own website. And the first thing their own expert points out is the very first thing that will happen when this engine fires, assuming everything has been installed properly, is the rings will start to rotate around the ring lands. And that's normal. As the piston goes up and down and the engine is operating, the rings will move all around. They're supposed to. That's how it works. And so you can spend a whole bunch of time trying to come up with precise measurements as to where all the gaps should be, but all that goes out the window with the very first crank of the engine. All the rings start to move, and they're going to move in all different directions. So there may come a time where they all line up with each other. And then they'll move just as fast. So I would say try not to line all the gaps up so they're in the same place, but don't put too much stock or effort into trying to be super precise about where the gaps end up, because it really doesn't matter. The engine is going to put them where it wants them to be. So now I've put the top ring in place. And so now we have all three pieces, the bottom and the top rings and the expander in between. And you can see as I rotate this, it moves as a unit, and it should. It is now one ring, the oil control ring. Once that's on, the next ring to go on will be the second ring. It's extremely important that for the second ring and the top ring that you put the correct side of the ring up. Piston manufacturers or ring manufacturers use a variety of different methods in order to help you determine which way is up. In the case of most Mahle rings, they put the logo, their company logo, on the top side of the ring. And so I know this is the top of the second ring. And so now all I need to do to install this ring is to take my expander, load the ring into it, place the ring over the piston, release the expander, and just make sure that it spins freely. It looks like there's a little groove in between the top and the second ring, and it looks like I got it hooked in there a little bit. We put the tool back on. There we go. And so now the second ring is in the second ring groove. It moves freely all the way around. And again, because it moves, and it will move when the engine operates, I wouldn't invest a whole lot of time in trying to determine which way the gap ends up. Maybe set the gap the way you want it, or position the gaps just before you install the piston in the engine, just so you'll feel good that they're not all lined up. But again, don't put too much energy into that. And then finally, our top ring. The Mahle logo is right here. Not sure if it shows up on the camera, but this is top for the top ring. So I'll go ahead and load that in my expander. And move it over the piston. And there we go. There is the top ring. And that's all there is to installing the rings on the piston. This piston is now ready to install in the cylinder bore. I would say just be careful if you haven't done this before. Take a little bit of time. Don't be afraid to take it back apart if you're not satisfied with it. And then be extremely careful when you install the pistons, obviously, so you don't break a ring. The only other thing I would recommend, and I didn't show it on camera here, is before you install the rings and prepare to install the pistons in the engine block, lubricate these rings. And you don't have to go crazy with it. Put some oil on your fingers, wipe your fingers around the ring, just so there's a film of oil on the ring. You can use engine oil, you can use assembly lube, you can use whatever you're comfortable with, but a thin coating. I've met people that tell you the best way to install a piston is to take the whole piston, dunk it in a bucket of oil, and then install the piston. That is far too much oil. And if you're not going to start the engine right away, all of it's going to leak out anyway. If you are going to start the engine right away, all that extra oil is going to cause problems with the movement of the piston and then combustion. So the idea is just to put enough lubrication so that the rings can rotate freely in their grooves on the piston, so that as you're moving the engine through and the various operations, as you rotate the crankshaft, for instance, to install each of the pistons, and then perhaps degree the crankshaft, so that it's lubricated as you move it. Once you start the engine, the lubrication will come from the engine oil system, as with anything else. Oil splash on the cylinder walls, the rings get lubricated, and that's sufficient. You'll notice that the rings look like they don't fit the piston. when they're installed. That's normal if you haven't done this before or seen what this looks like before. That's normal. Once they get compressed down to fit the bore, they'll close up to the point where that gap that you measured and filed in the bore is all that's exposed. In order to get it to that point, you have to use a ring compressor in order to prepare the pistons for installation. But it's normal for them to look like they're sticking out when you've just installed them like this. So now that's all it takes. It's ready to install in the bore.